Good to see all of you tonight at this is our fifth HSP Exchange, and I wanted to just say welcome. And I wanted to thank our two hosts. We had two host schools, Union Theological Seminary and the dean there, Pamela Cooper White, and Seminary of the Southwest, and the president there, Cynthia Kittredge. And we want to thank you for being the host for this every time we have an exchange. And we have two wonderful Episcopalian leaders, and they said yes right away that they would host it, and they've been a very important part in supporting the work tonight. As you know, the HSP Exchange, we started the exchange in an effort to reach out and begin conversations and have ways of connecting with the community about different topics that are important. And so we are delighted that the Dr. Altagracia, you're going to have to forgive me. Reverend Canon, Doctor, how do I put that together? Anyway, Altagracia, child of God, wonderful friend, leader, has agreed to speak tonight, and we are delighted. Tonight, we're having a special conversation about women in leadership in the church and work that Altagracia has been involved in. And we're just delighted to be able to be a part and to listen to her tonight. And I just want to make a quick note and just let those of you who are alums and have participated in the HSP. The HSP, for those of you who don't know, has been around since 1989. And for the last 32 years, every June, we host a 2-week intensive. These last 2 years, because of COVID, the pandemic, we have been doing it online. And we bring about 55, 65 students together from around the theological schools, and they're all involved in MAs or MDivs, and they come together, all Latinx mostly, with a Latinx faculty, and we have wonderful classes. Every year we offer 5 to 7 new classes. And Altagracia was a professor about 3 years ago, and it was my first meeting with her, and it was a delight. Well, all of the alums were excited to announce to you that we're going to be launching an alumni association, which we're going to call the Alumni Network. And we've heard from so many of you saying that you're interested in connecting with us, but also connecting with one another. So we're going to be talking about that alumni network. We're going to have more information. Just wanted to give you a heads up. We're going to have more details about what it's about. Invite you to join us with your ideas. Decide to be a part of it. That's going to be great. And you don't have to be an official alum to join, okay? Even though we call it the Alumni Network. Anyone who is a part of our extended community is more than welcome. And we say bienvenido to become a part of the community. Altagracia, as I said, is now professor at the Virginia Theological Seminary, a wonderful thinker. She's an activist, a pastor, and she will be speaking tonight. And when she's done, we'll have an opportunity for small groups and for discussion. Altagracia, bienvenida y muchas gracias. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you
so much, Dr. Machado. I feel so privileged to have been invited to talk with this wonderful group of people. I'm especially excited because it's the kind of group I like, where there's like folks from all the different worlds, right? There are academics and church folk and students and community folk, and I feel really privileged. Thank you so much, Dr. Machado. It's one of those things when the people that you have admired and had on pedestal suddenly become your colleagues and friends. So I think some of the people in the room know what that feels like. So I'm very excited to be here with all of you. I was a longtime admirer of this program and always wondered, like in the back of my mind, like, how do you get invited to speak? And then I had the gift of being invited to serve on the HSP faculty in June of 2019. And the wonderful thing about being in that space was just the opportunity to go in depth on issues. And I was teaching a class on leadership, a practical theology class on leadership, to be able to go into a conversation in depth about Latino contexts or about the life of Latino leaders who were serving in other contexts, and to be able to do that without reservation, unapologetically, without any concern, because there was an intentional centering of Latin American folk of Latin American descent, folk that identify as Latinx, folks that were interested in the ministry of that, the ministries of that community. And that was the first time in my life that I had that experience where I could just unapologetically be in conversation about the important issues to the various Latino communities that are part of the US and are part of the church. It was also super just amazing to spend time with Latino and Latina scholars and to learn about their academic work, their commitments, a little bit about their families, and just to get to know them. To see them and then to feel seen by them was pretty powerful for me. And it was important. It came at an important time because that was the summer that I transitioned to Virginia Theological Seminary to serve as full-time faculty. And before that, all of my teaching had been church-based and community-based. And so I really benefited from the opportunity to be in conversation with experienced scholars who had forged the way ahead of me at various levels of their journey as academics, so super seasoned and folks that have been doing it for a few years. And I really do feel like it got me ready in a different way to join the faculty here at Virginia Theological Seminary. And then the reason why I wanted to be with you all in this particular context is because of the opportunity that it affords for a wider circle of people to engage in a conversation that's important for the Latino community and for leaders, not only Latino leaders, but leaders who are seeking to be in collaboration with, who are seeking to be allies, to be co-workers in the vineyard with Latino leaders, Latino theologians, and Latino scholars. And so I was glad to be able to, I participated in one of these and was glad when I just felt super privileged to be asked to share a little bit about some work that I've been involved in. So tonight, it's the nightmare of like, don't talk too long. Because my key to this encounter is it's all about the conversation we're going to have. But what I want to do is offer a little bit of information, enough of a synopsis to get a good conversation going about research that's being done as part of the Flourishing in Ministry project, and in particular, their research on emergent clergywomen. This particular project is being funded by the Lilly Foundation with their ongoing interest in what makes for vital and healthy ministry, especially with their emphasis on leadership. And it is based and nestled in the Wellbeing at Work program that's at the University of Notre Dame. It's branded Work Well. They even have a little research app that I'll tell you about if you want to join and be one of those folks from whom they can collect information as they continue to do their research. What I want to do to play it safe is to tell you why this particular research I think is important for us to have in conversation. As they did, they're doing a longitudinal qualitative research project where they are interviewing women who are in their first call. And given the way and they've done other research on clergy, they do research on clergy, on folks that are in the caring professions, so aid workers, medical doctors, nurses, and it's all part of that research about being well at work, thriving, well-being at work. And so they've done it with men, they've done it with women, lots of cohorts and lots of categories. But in their work around women who are in their first call, and this is restricted to 3 denominations, primarily because it was the easiest to get data and connections to do the kind of longitudinal study they wanted to do. So it's the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and the Presbyterian Church USA. And so in their research of these groups, in every category, every theme that surfaced in these interviews about their call, about thriving, about what role gender does or does not play in their call story, in the way that they've been integrated into their ministry, into the formation of their own ministry identity. For every single theme and every single category, the experience, especially of sexism and the various obstacles of a patriarchal tradition, were exacerbated for women of color. So for Black women and for Latinas, it was like all the things, right? And so all the things I'm about to talk about that are the themes that came up in the research were more acute for women of African descent and women of Latin American descent. So I want to say that first. And then the second thing I want to say, because I want to make sure I say it and not run out of time, is that this work was done specifically on emerging clergy women. So these are women in their first call in ministry in a congregation, full-time. But what I heard as things were being presented to those of us who were invited in as scholars who might write or build or develop curriculum using the various the research data, was that what they were saying about women who were entering ordained ministry was definitely true of women in general. So women in the church, women who serve as leaders, especially when it comes to the categories of formal leadership. And the reason I say that is because a lot of their narratives and the stories that they share about their call and about the support they did or did not get, the mentors they did or did not have, the encouragement that they did or did not receive, that was happening to women who were serving in leadership in congregations, some of them for decades before they came into the call process for ordained ministry. And so there's no reason for us to think that their experience, although in this particular research focusing on their pastoral identity and their role as ordained persons, the fact that that experience as women in leadership in the church is something that's shared by all, and that the implications are not just for those of us in the academy who are equipping and preparing women for ministry. It's not just for the institutional churches, right, which are we are represented in the room as we receive the reports and the research data. But it's also important for those who care about the church and are grounded in their work in congregations. So especially, and I'll speak particularly to the Latinx context, like what do these questions, right? What do these issues say about the way that we support and foment the leadership of women in our congregations? And what are the ways that cultural factors and the way that patriarchy plays itself out in Latin American culture, right, which may look a little different than in other cultures. Unlucky for us, patriarchy is alive and well in all the cultures. But what are the questions that it raises for us who are seeking to raise up strong women leaders that are called to ministry, whether that be as laypersons or ordained? So those, as I share really quickly the information that some of the central themes of the research, think about what does this say for us as a church? So now I'm going to run through my notes to see if I can give you enough information so we can have a good conversation. The person who is leading this particular project, the Emergent Clergy Women Research under the Flourishing Ministry Research Project, did interviews, again, like I said, with 3 mainline denominational churches. They've invited a group of scholars, representative of the 3 denominations, to receive their reports. And the qualitative research was done, in a narrative way. So for multiple reasons, and you can get into that in your conversations if you like, but because it was building on the importance of the story in people's narrative around their call to ministry. Also because story then encapsulates what happened in their communities, in their families, and in their churches. And often it is through story, that our tradition as a tradition of the Christians, as a tradition of the book, right, are very much many theological truths are spoken in narrative. And then also because of the ways that identity and identity formation is seen in social psychology as a narrative task that begins in adolescence with various keystone events. And then there are chapters, there are characters. I mean, it is a story. So the hope is that we who have been invited to these writing conferences will take the material and write articles or use it as part of our ongoing research about women in ministry. But it is also the hope that some of the things that we will produce will be things that will have immediate impact to the women, for the women themselves. And so there is a blog project that is on their website, and I'll share the website information later. There is a support network for women who are entering into ministry that's been formed by the women in this cohort, and then they were invited to invite others. And here at Virginia Theological Seminary, we plan to have a series of webinars on topics that are key to helping women prepare for what they will experience in the congregation. The most surprising thing for the researchers was how shocked the women were at the amount of sexual harassment and sexual mistreatment they experienced in congregations. It caught them off guard. And considering that the majority of the women are second career women, and that many of them had full-blown careers, were professionals in other fields, the fact that they were so surprised was surprising to the researchers, but they speak about the fact that for them, the church has been both a place, some of the women talked about it as the church is both a place of hope and of despair and challenge, right? And so as ordained women who were entering into their ministries, that sense that, well, this is like that this shouldn't happen in church, and that I'm your pastor. Like, why would you speak to me that way? Some of it was very, very overt, and were things like commenting on women's legs, commenting on women's breasts, especially commenting on women as they did or did not fit into various vestments intended for the liturgical worship role. Just the shock. And then things that were meant to be complimentary, oh, you're such a beautiful sweetheart, or you're so lovely, I can't stop staring at you, just things that the person who shared them, mostly men, but sometimes also older women, said to the women leaders that were in their congregations. So some of the topics, for example, that we're hoping to do in this webinar/podcast are just simple things like navigating the search for your first church appointment. Just what are the kinds of questions you should ask? What are the kinds of things you should press with your judicatory heads? An understanding of the fact that many women come into this because their own call story has always been held against the backdrop of a masculine narrative, right? A male narrative. And then that leads to some insecurity, some issues of self-esteem, some self-doubt about their capacity to live into a role that is always male-shaped, even though our denominations have been ordaining women for decades. And so one of the topics is no pastor is good enough to cover all that, right? Just an understanding of what the role is, and that just because some people come in and they can fake it better than others, it isn't because I should have known this, or I should have understood this, or should have anticipated this, or why wasn't I prepared for this? That they not assume that is part of a challenge that is presented to them, particularly because of their gender, especially when in the congregation, it is often raised up as you're inexperienced, you're not a real pastor, you didn't do too bad for a woman, right? These kinds of comments that get used. Another topic is like bodies out of place. What happens when the priest has a female body? My surprise or my sadness about the whole receiving the research data was that as a person who served the church for 25 years as a priest, it was a little horrifying that all of the stories were the stories of the women that went into ministry when I went into ministry. And that, 25, 30 years later, these were still the issues that were being presented. And so the fact that for many of these women in 2021, I guess they started in 2019, they are still trailblazers decades into the ordination of women, because the places where many of them get placed are solo, small congregations, many of them in rural, desolate areas, places that reflect what was found in the Presbyterian Church USA did a survey on gender equality and justice. And what they found was that over half of those lay folks who took the survey thought that women should have, equal access, wanted to support the ordination and formation of women as pastors, but then but then a much greater majority said that they would not call a pastor for their own church. So not seeing the contradiction, or the fact that in that same survey, the vast majority of women, like 80+% of the women, said that they had experienced some level of harassment, discrimination in posts, microaggressions in their contexts. And when the lay folk were surveyed on the same question, they said that they didn't think it was a problem anymore in the church. And so the disconnect between the reality of their experiences as women entering their first pastorates and what the church thinks, expects, and wants, which continues to be a pull. It's a stretch for the congregation, and it's also a stretch for the women who have to take the role of the pastor and stretch it so that they and their realities are able to fit the role. The many comments about the ways in which they don't fit, right? How the reason all of these issues are critical is because pastoral identity, which is formed like all other identity in community, continues to be formed for these women when they leave seminary, right? It's not like seminaries finish forming full pastors and they pop out and ready to go. But because it is formed in community, when they enter communities that are hostile and not supportive, it challenges their ability to grow into a healthy identity as a pastor and leaves them with a lot of self-doubt and a lot of struggles that affect their mental health. So added stress, added feelings of isolation, inability to find folks that they can identify with and have conversations with. And so the importance of other women in ministry, supporting and mentoring women who are entering ordained ministry. And the fact that their bodies, their voices, their assertiveness, some of the women declared that for them, it had been the most gendered space they had ever had to work in. So even though some of them were CEOs of companies, some of them worked in public health and had worked in big institutions and were at leadership and administrative level, the church was the most gendering space they'd ever entered in, because everything they did, the way they did it or how they did it was equated to the fact that they were women. As opposed to just, that's her personality, or that's her style, or that's the kind of leader she is. And one of the questions that is left to be answered is, if some of I'd like to think that the reason so many of us as women leaders are very mutual and team building in our leadership style, right? That's because it's all about the kingdom of God and the priesthood of all believers and the fact that we are about justice. The question is left, is it because it's the only option we have as a leadership style? That if you are assertive, if you are direct, if you take a more, for lack of a better word, a more hierarchical role in your leadership style, that you will not be received well, that will not be received well, that you will be identified as pushy, as having a chip on your shoulder, as not having a sense of humor, all the things in 2021. So among the issues that women faced in general, several of which were shared with men in a cohort that was also asked questions about their first ministry experience, and that was more acute for women of color, were situations where the negotiating of their first salary was often a seeking for the clergy person to be paid below the minimum. So these denominations have minimums, and the women were to be contracted at below minimum, sometimes for the excuse of if they were married, it was because you have a spouse and your spouse has an income. And if they weren't married, it was because you're single and you don't have a need of as many expenses, right? So you get hurt either way. And this is not something that's unknown to, for example, in our denomination, in the Episcopal Church, Latino clergy are chronically underpaid and paid less than all of their European American counterparts, and often, in order to be able to take a full-time job, have to accept one that is below the diocesan minimum. So that's something that's shared by men, and especially men of color, but that came out for for these women. For a lot of the men and women both, what was part of their call was their desire to be engaged in social justice ministries, and then the recognition that the church that those were not the priorities of the congregations to which they had been called, that the congregations were concerned about congregational vitality and growth, that they were concerned about pastoral care, that they were concerned about the institution and the tradition, and that also led to some dissatisfaction for folks that were entering. And so this was true for both men and women. And I would imagine is also true in contexts, and this is a question that I would ask you, if you would experience this as being true in contexts where a Latina is leading a congregation that is both of the dominant culture and of Latino folks. So in a lot of our denominations, a full-time job, if you're a person that is bilingual and bicultural, means that you run a church that's bilingual and bicultural, and you have multiple folks to respond to. And so that the social justice themes that hold relevance for the Latin American folk are not holding relevance for the European American folks, that some of their priorities are different. Because some of the women were in spaces that never wanted to hire a woman, and that were in conservative parts of the country geographically, there is a distinction in that issue between those that are called to urban parishes or called to serve as assistants or associates versus those who were put as solo pastors of small congregations in more conservative places. So that's not, everybody. And one of the gifts of this being a narrative form of research is that it allows for the themes to emerge while not condensing the particularity of the variety of their contexts. And so certain themes come up in the research, but how it gets played is different depending on the churches they serve, their own intersectional realities in terms of being women, Black women, Latina women, lesbian women. So all those issues are still present in the thick description that we receive from the research because it was done through storytelling. So I don't know who's going to give me the time's up note. Please, somebody wave their hands madly if I'm going too long. So the other thing that the last thing that I want to talk about real quickly, first, the importance of mentors and exemplars. In their call stories, women did not always have a narrative for what was happening to them in their spiritual lives where they felt a call. those that were from Roman Catholic backgrounds, that were from evangelical backgrounds, where women were not encouraged, conservative fundamentalist backgrounds, where women were not encouraged to be prepared as ministers, but were encouraged to be ministers' wives, pastors' wives. The importance this theme runs when they first saw their first woman in the pulpit, when they first met a woman who was a pastor, and what it meant for them, because it finally gave them like a category, an example, some language for what it was that they had felt the Spirit doing in their lives. And also the importance of mentors, and especially male mentors. The ability of several of the women did not struggle in their call and in their identity as a pastor, because all along they had strong male mentors who assumed, of course, that's a call. What you're describing to me, like they're pastors who responded, God has a call on your life. It's time for you to discern. Let's talk about what that would be. Those folks are the folks that responded to their call when they were younger. It was a more direct kind of pipeline, what we think of, though it's not, a traditional call where God calls upon someone's life as a young adult. So the last thing I wanted to mention was just, and even though the language of microaggressions, of course, in research is problematic, right? Because they're so, because the ambiguity of the category makes it difficult to know, is this just a person's perception? Was it because of their own issues? Is this a person that is especially triggered because of their own experience of abuse? And so all the various arguments that are going on in the field of social psychology around microaggressions. So the language that is used to describe what these women talk about, and the way they talked about it, was everyday sexism. That it wasn't just the big things with their ordination processes or their bishops or whoever it was that they needed to deal with, but it was also all the little everyday gnawing at your identity, yourself, your capacity to function that was most difficult. And building on some of the work that was done on racial microaggressions, thank you, Jorge, on racial microaggressions by, here, let me get you the name of the scholar. So specifically by Daryl Wing Sue. That work has been adapted for conversation in this particular research project in order to describe the various typologies of how microaggressions play out. So sexual objectification, literally the body as an object that can be commented on and carried on. Invisibility, which is almost like a joke, right? Like every time I gather with a group of women and we've been through a meeting, it's always so damn impressive how like that really brilliant idea that our male colleague just had that we shared 20 minutes ago, right? Like just the invisibilizing of women and their leadership. The clear comments of women's inferiority, and in the church context, often backed by traditional theology that talks about the way that women themselves are especially sinful, problematic, tempting to men, sexist language, the whole baby, honey, sweetheart thing, stereotypical assumptions about gender. So we talked a little bit about it, but like, oh, sensitive, submissive, soft-spoken, overly emotional, even when it's positive, understanding, but always with that connotation that it's not because this is your charism and your gift, but it's because you're a woman, and that's why you have these particular characteristics. And then the environmental messages, right? The way that it's embedded in organizational structure, like the hiring processes, the salaries, the vestments. And so what I say that it leaves us, especially in Latino congregations, how many of our congregations are having conversations about the role of women in ministry, especially because people will be quick to say the church would die were it not for the leadership of women. And yet, when it's time for the deacon board or the person that's going to represent at the regional meeting, or that still those kinds of formal, identified as leader roles are still being taken up by men. And then what Daryl Wing Sue offers is a disarming of microaggressions and like just the best practices that one could offer. And I'm not going to have time to talk all the way through it, but the capacity of folk to, hold on, let me see if I can find the list. So there's just a list of direct and indirect ways of disarming those who are caught up in these who are caught up in it, so that when, as an ally, as an observer, as a person who is witnessing, right, microaggressions, the ability to diffuse, to name, to confront, and the various ways of doing it. There's this lovely, and I will stick it in the chat, and I have all these links to stick in the chat. Ways in which to respond around microaggressions. And that particular article that I mentioned got enough buzz so that it was in the New York Times, and I'm going to stick, it was talked about how to respond to microaggressions, was an article in Smarter Living in the New York Times a while ago. So I'm going to go ahead and put that link in there as well. So I'm going to stop. I have like 2 other pages of notes. So I'm hoping that any question you ask, I'll be able to respond, but I look forward to your, to the conversation.
Thank you, Altagracia. We can really, this is a topic that'll give you 2 hours, right? And still you have more. I kept on thinking as you were talking, I was ordained in 1984, and it sounds like it's 1985, doesn't it? I mean, it's so sad. And I think about, I was 28, so now, I'm old now, I feel it now. But at that time I was rather chicky, I was, and that first ministry, that first church you go to is so important in shaping how you understand yourself. So this is a fascinating project, and I wanted to thank you for doing that. And I just want to tell the group that the HSP and its work, we're thinking about doing regional conversations and regional workshops. And believe me when I tell you that Altagracia will be tapped for a regional workshop that we want to do, because we are considering issues of gender. And a lot of our students that come to the program, a lot of our allies and our supporters are women in ministry. And I know that we have men also tonight who support and who want this work to happen, and our allies. And so we want to engage this. So we will continue. And we have the YouTube channel where this talk will be presented, and we can add links. So we'll be sure to have the data that you want from this. And thank you to Pam for giving the name of the article. So, don't worry about this. We'll get this to you. This is not a secret. We'll get this to you. We want you to have it. Muchas gracias una vez más, Altagracia. This is really wonderful. Jorge, will tell us about the small groups, because we're going to do small groups and come back and it'll give you time to respond and to kind of listen to this, listen to the group and also your reactions, okay? I want to give Altagracia an opportunity to respond, but also to share her last thoughts with us.
So I wanted to highlight that what Janae said and Sarah said have an important connecting point, which is this whole, I could call it ministry, the role of accompaniment in the empowerment of women in ministry was critical. So that there are stories of the women that were able to negotiate better salary packages were women who had somebody supporting them and saying, you walk in and you say this because this person got paid this person got, but it was a network, right? It was networked information that then, and she describes it as like, I literally had to go argue for this salary because I couldn't go back home and let him know that I had not fought for myself, right? But it was the kind of support that they needed. And I think Sarah talks about it too, in terms of like not allowing the next generation of girls who are being called to ministry to feel that this is like, that they're going to enter this desert wasteland by themselves, right? That they need to be, that role of accompaniment. And it was interesting because for some of the women, it was women in their lives, sometimes their grandmothers, sometimes a leader in the church, who themselves had felt a call to ministry and were never able to pursue the call, who were their fiercest advocates in the process. And so being able to have that kind of love and support is critical. The one thing I would like to say is that one of the things that, if I were going to add something, is that I think that Janae is hitting it, and we were talking about it, those of us in these denominations and institutions, about the need to target points of power and challenge those points with the responsibility of ensuring that the education is required within their denomination or network of churches. Not everybody's in a denomination, right? Or network of churches. Because how will those lay folk in a congregation learn about gender inequality, sexism, the importance of women in ministry and all of that, if they're not challenged, forced, required to at least have the conversation? Because that educational piece at the congregational level is very optional. Even if a denomination or, whatever regional gathering, offers a workshop, the people that are not about that are not going to show up. So making it a requirement of people who want to call on you. Like I tell people, I'm the second Latina rector in the Episcopal Church, whole nation, when I was first became the rector, and the first in a Latino congregation. And I'm not that old. Come on, Daisy, we're not that old. Like this is shameful, right? That we're still talking about firsts and seconds and stuff.
It is shameful. Yes.
It is totally shameful. But the reason why I even got that interview was because it was a diocesan policy that every single search list had to include a woman, a person of color, and an LGBTQ person. Like they could not submit a list for interviews. They could not go on to the interview phase without there being a candidate in each of those boxes. That's how I got the interview. And they ended up selecting me because they really felt I was the best match. But I would have never even had the conversation. So how do we pressure those? And like you said, right, create that transparency around salary, benefits. By the third contract, I knew what to ask for because I only learned every time I made a big mistake and suffered for it, right? So just, that sharing of information, knowledge, so that people are not reinventing the wheel every single generation of women leaders. That's not cool. Oh. So I'm gonna stop talking now.
No, that means you have to begin to rethink everything when people have already gone through it. And I think that's something that to bring together generations of conversations is another important piece that we can do. And it's not that complicated, but it's important because as generations listen to one another, that's when you begin to go, the aha moments, and you realize, wow, this is not cool. But there are ways of thinking about it. So una vez más, Altagracia, millones de gracias. The island of Santo Domingo has wonderful Puerto Rico, I can't forget. Y ahí metemos a Cuba también, ya that we're talking about it, ¿verdad? Because the three of them and the entire Caribbean is represented in so many people. Just delighted to have you. And again, I will be in contact with you about how we can foster these conversations for the women in the HSP network in a bigger way. We're almost done, out of time, and I want to be with the rain and everything. For those of us in the Northeast, it's been a really terrible day. And I hope everyone has been safe and sound and it's good. But I just want to remind you that the rollout of the alumni network next month, where you'll have the opportunity to sign up, and you'll also have the opportunity, if you want to work I want to have an alumni council to help us guide us in terms of activities, that the things that we want to do to make the network a lively one. It doesn't help if you belong to a network and nobody ever knows what you're doing, right? We need activity and we want you to be a part of it. And we know that women are the ones, one of the movers and the shakers. So we're going to get this done and happening. The HSP continues to work. We just finished our 32nd session in June. We go on for our 33rd session next June in 2022. We're going to be hosted by Duke Divinity School, which now has today, he was installed a Puerto Rican dean. So again, we have to go and go, yeah. So things happen, they're surprises. And so we celebrate Edgardo Colón Emerick as a new Dean of Duke. And we celebrate the leadership of all of our people, wherever they are, because the work has to be done and we have women and men who are there and doing it. To everyone else tonight who was not Latinx, that's fine. We love you. You're part of us. You belong to us. We belong to you. We need you to advocate for us. We need you to be our partners. We need you to stand up for us. We need you to say things that we can't say. So you're always welcome to be a part of who we are in the work of the HSP. October the 6th, 7:00, the next exchange. And we're going to have Dr. Chris Tigres, who's going to talk about faith and activism. And he is at DePaul University, a young and up-and-coming Catholic scholar. And so we're looking forward to seeing and being with him October the 6th, 7:00, Dr. Chris Tigres. So I'll see you guys next month, October the 6th, 7:00. For those of you who are beginning a semester of schoolwork, get strong, do your work. It's going to be great. And for those of you who are in churches, blessings for all you do. And wherever you are, may you know that you are part of a community and that you do not walk alone. Adelante, pueblo. Adelante, HSP. Buenas noches, everyone. Thank you, Altagracia. Se te quiere mucho.
Sounds right.